Hi there, welcome back to Built Not Bought by Bruce. I'm working on the XS650. I found a problem that I think is fairly common, but in researching it, I couldn't find a lot of good information on it. I decided that what I would do is put together a video that would cover all aspects of the Cush springs. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to start with a little introduction. I want to talk a little bit about the word Cush. I want to talk about the function of these springs and how a Cush drive is handled in other motorcycles. And I want to show you how I took apart, dismantled the clutch basket with the Cush springs. And I want to show you how I put it all back together. I'm going to split this into, let's see, 1, 2, 3, probably 4 chapters. So chapter 1 you're watching right now is just going to be the introduction and explanation of Cush. Then I'm going to show you how I took mine apart. Then I'll show you the reassembly. And then I'll do a quick conclusion. So if you don't want to know anything about Cush or Cush drives, if you know about them, whatever, then you can skip over this first chapter. But for those of you who are interested, where does this word Cush come from? What is it? Because it's an odd term to me. In doing some research, Cush has biblical references. Cush was the brother of Canaan. It's all in Genesis if you want to go read it. Not a Genesis fan, but anyway, that's beside the point. Also, I found definitions that included a stash of money. I believe it's a means of smoking marijuana, thus Cush lounge. Cush is also, slang for good or cool. Having the Cush office might be the corner office with windows, kind of an abbreviation for cushy. I'm going to guess that the Brits decided that just like they do with bushing, they abbreviate it to bush. Cushion or cushioning, they decided to abbreviate to Cush. Now, for me, a bush is either something that grows in my backyard or it's something that grows in one's nether regions. It isn't a bushing. You British guys, no hate mail. I'm giving you a hard time. Function of a Cush drive or Cush springs is to absorb the torque or torsional load of the engine and drivetrain. And I'm going to explain a little bit more there why I didn't say clutch. Many other manufacturers other than Yamaha, and Yamaha may do a Cush drive on some of their models, I don't know, but specifically the XS650 does not use a typical Cush drive. So a typical Cush drive would be rubber blocks, rubber or urethane or some kind of material in the rear wheel hub. And that's kind of a typical Cush drive. Honda uses or has used that system in a lot of their models. The other way to cushion things, and I guess this is a good point to talk about, what are we trying to cushion? So there's 2 different things that we're trying to work on here, and 2 things I found in my research. So the power stroke of the engine. When the spark plug fires and drives the piston and rod down, turning the crankshaft, that's quite a volatile kind of hit. It's a hard hit on everything in that system. That gets transmitted through the drivetrain. The other thing we're trying to do is to cushion or take up the torque, the torsion, when we disengage the clutch. So when we disengage it is when we have drive. When we engage the clutch is when we use the clutch to disconnect the motor from the drivetrain. So when we disengage the clutch, there's obviously some power there, and there's a need to cushion that. Now, depending on where you want to provide that cushion or that absorption of torque, it depends on where you put your cush, if you will. So on a Harley Davidson Big V twin, they put a compensating sprocket right on the crankshaft. With a Big V twin like that, long stroke, big displacement, you're going to get a considerable power in the power stroke. There's going to be a lot of torque there. So for Harley, they want to absorb a bunch of that right at the crankshaft. And it's only the initial hit that you absorb, obviously. Well, not obviously. When the torque or the impact has been absorbed, then you can control the torque and apply it. So Harley Davidson uses a compensating sprocket. In the case of, as I said, with Hondas and other manufacturers, they don't seem to be as concerned about the power strokes coming from the engine. I believe their focus is more on the disengagement of the clutch, the power coming through the clutch, which could be quite abrupt if you let the clutch out quickly. What they're trying to do is take up some of the torque with the rear hub and absorb some of that until it's under control. In the case of the XS650 or an automotive application, in an automotive application, the clutch disc has springs. Some have 4. I've seen them with up to 6. I don't know if I've seen more than that, but they have springs that could be considered Cush springs that absorb in the clutch plate the application of the torque from the engine. The XS650 is doing something very similar. On the back of the clutch basket, on the primary gear, which is coming right off the crankshaft, they have 6 Cush springs mounted in there. So they're providing cushioning between the primary gear right off the crankshaft and the transmission. And the application of the clutch is also controlled by those springs. Not in a big way. This is very small stuff. It's not like you notice a bunch of wind-up or anything. That's what Cush springs do. Knowing that, we can take a look at what's happened with the Cush springs on the engine I have, and I've seen many that are like this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move over to the lift where I have everything set up. I'm going to show you the dismantle section, or chapter, pardon me. I'm going to show you the dismantle chapter of this video, let you watch that, and I'll be back to you soon, and we'll put this thing back together. So Yamaha, when they built this engine, in the clutch, they used what they call Cush springs. So they put these springs in on the back side of the clutch drum on this primary gear. So they make total sense. Great idea. The issue is, as you can see, maybe I'll use this camera. As you can see, we're missing one spring here, and that concerns me, because where is that spring? Now, with this motor, I've taken it totally apart. I've had it right down to the cases. I've had everything out of it, had the cases vapor blasted, rebuilt the transmission, put the crankshaft back in, new seals and everything. So I didn't find that spring in there anywhere. But it could be a problem if if this spring, and I'll show you what probably happened with it. This one, you can see, is broken and rattling around. These don't rattle around, but this one is busted. There, that's where it's broken, right there. This is what is a fairly typical problem from what I understand. So once they break, there is the chance that they will come out. That's probably what happened to this one. I'm going to need to order up a set of 6 springs, but this is further complicated, and I've found videos on how to change the springs, but what I haven't found is any videos that show you how to get this thing apart, because here's what's going on. If we look inside the clutch drum, these are rivets. They're not bolts. And if we look on the backside, here's the backside of the rivets. So you can see pretty clearly the rivet inside here. Now, from what I've read, this little shoulder is going to be separate from this plate, this retaining plate. So we need to get this rivet broken loose from this, then this retaining plate will come off. Every spring kit that I've found from various suppliers comes with 3 low clearance bolts to replace these rivets. The first thing I want to do to get ready to drill these rivets out is to center punch each one of them. And that gave us a pretty good mark. Oh, don't like that. That's better. Perfect. We can run with those. All right, I have my safety glasses on. My sleeves pushed up out of the way. I've lined this up. We're going to use a little bit of cutting oil here. Always remember to lubricate. There we go. So the rivet started spinning. You can see that edge is starting to lift now. It's really not taking much effort. I'm not giving it much of a hit here. Sure enough, I was able to take the chisel and just go around and lift that piece off of there. It broke loose fairly easily. Now the test is to see if that rivet will come out of there. For right now, I'll finish the drilling. So I've been gently prying on the edge of the retainer, and then once I had it moving a little bit, I got underneath the gear here, just with an old screwdriver, something soft that wouldn't cause any damage, and just very gently. I haven't been putting a lot of pressure on, and sure enough, the retainer plate came off, which is awesome. And now we can see what's going on in here. So here's our rivets, and there's some kind of, almost looks like there's some kind of bushing on them or something. And I'll have to see if that's part of the bolt kit that comes with this. So this will lift off now. Let me just set that there for a second. And then these springs come out. And here's the broken one. So with the press, I'm able to push that old rivet out of these bushings. And I just did a little digging, and I cannot find those available anywhere. Right, here we are, ready to start assembling this. Let's take a look at the pieces that are involved here. We have the clutch basket, aluminum. We have the primary gear that comes right off of the crankshaft, big steel gear. And we have a retaining plate or a retainer for the springs that keeps the Cush springs captive in the whole setup here. We'll start putting it together in a minute. I wanted to touch on a few things that I've learned and that I've noticed. What you can see on here is there is some wear in these depressions for the springs. Some things to note is there's a flat, and I don't know if you'd call this a thrust washer, but this washer is going to take the load of this spring washer, and this thing's kind of cool because it's I don't think bevel's the right term, but it's kind of cone shaped. This one is going to keep pressure on the gear so that the gear can move on the clutch basket, because that's where the torque, where the cushion or where it's absorbed is in the gear being able to move on the clutch basket. I want to show you a couple things, but while I have this apart, I'm just going to do this. I'm a big fan of assembly lube. I don't care whose assembly lube it is. I just like things to have some lube on them. Lubrication's good in all areas of life. But this just makes sure that on startup, we're not going to have any galling or anything. I don't know what's going to be moving here. We'll take this one and we'll do the same thing. Maybe I won't do that yet because I want to show you something first. So we'll just set that aside for a second. It's really cool the way this is made. The gear goes on. The 3 bolts go through here and retain all of this. But if you line this up, you'll notice that these 3 right there, the ones that are always, if you look at them in pairs, the ones that are to the right, the opening in the steel gear is exactly the same as the depression in the housing, in the clutch basket. But if you look at the other ones, the ones to the left, each one, the opening in the gear or in the center surface of the gear is bigger than the depression in the clutch basket. What's going to happen is as this starts to absorb torque initially, it's going to have the force, the resistance of 3 springs. But as the torque comes on harder and we hit the edge of this opening, then we're going to get the other 3 springs pushing as well, or the resistance from them. And the limiting factor is going to be this bolt with these spacers that I was careful to keep when I took the rivets out and not to damage. So these little spacers are going to limit how far that can go. That's going to limit the compression on the spring and hopefully not bottom it right out. I don't know if this is a spacer or a bushing or a bush. I'm not sure what the proper name for that is either. I don't know the proper name for a lot of things, but anyway. But that's going to limit our travel. and it's going to act as a spacer around the bolt. The problem here, and there's a great analysis, and I'll put up the website, what does he call them, smedspeed.co.uk, whatever is the website. He does a great explanation of inertial torque on these engines. And because of the crankshaft configuration and the fact that the pistons are moving together, there's a lot of inertial torque here. I've looked to see if there are any performance Cush springs. There don't appear to be. There was a company that was making a set, I believe the three primary ones, sorry, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, the three primary ones were springs, and then you got urethane blocks, and I don't know how they determined the density, whatever. Anyway, there were urethane blocks. Interesting idea, not available anymore, so I'm not sure it worked out real well. As far as any kind of performance Cush spring, everybody seems to have the same standard kit. For an XS650 in stock trim, this is probably fine. I think the reason we're seeing broken springs now is just a matter of fatigue. These engines have been around for a long time. This has been around for a long time. Those springs have compressed and released how many times? So it's probably a spring fatigue thing more than anything, is my guess. If you're going to make some power, you know, if you're going to go to a big bore, if you're going to add nitrous, if you're going to add a turbo, whatever you're going to do to make more power out of this thing, you are going to tax these springs even more. And without a performance option, I'm just not sure how well these springs are going to stand up. So it's probably a good idea if you have a performance type engine to check them fairly regularly. The other thing I read that works really well with these XS650s is rephasing the crank. And that can be done, and there's some guys out there doing it. I'll try and throw up a couple website addresses here in the description. Rephasing would probably make these springs live a lot longer. Without rephasing, I think it's just a good idea to keep an eye on them. Using some assembly lube, I want to put this thrust washer, spring washer, whatever this is, I want to get it in place. I'm just going to give it a little spin so it's got some oil under it. Getting this centered is a bit of a challenge. I think in this case we're probably okay because there is a very slight wear pattern on the back of the gear here, and if we get this right, that should help to center that spring. The other thing before I forget, because this I didn't notice until I was cleaning this, and all of a sudden this washer came off of here. This is going to act to prevent wear as this gear moves. Because don't forget, what's going to happen here once this is together, the retaining plate and the clutch basket are one. They're locked together with the bolts. It's the gear that can move inside of those two. So there's a surface here that you don't want galling on the gear, and you want some kind of material between the two. So again, I'm just going to put a little assembly lube on here. Drop this guy back on. The springs in the depressions where the opening in the gear matches the depression, those springs are going to be held in pretty well, pretty straight, because more than half of the diameter of the spring is going to be in the opening. It's going to be held in place. So the retaining plate on those 3 springs will go on fairly easily. On the other 3, stage 2, if you will, of this torque absorption setup, stage 2, the spring is, when you put it in, the spring is only going to be held in the clutch basket. And a spring, if you squeeze just one side of it, a spring does arc a little bit. It's not much, it does arc. And you can squeeze this side together. This side is still going to be further apart, if you will. The problem with that is we have to get the opening in the retainer over the edge of the spring, because on those stage 2 springs, what's holding them in place when there's no torque applied to this is the top edge of the spring is in the retainer, is held in the retainer, and the bottom edge is held in the depression in the clutch basket. But in the center section of the spring, there is nothing holding it in place. There's no pressure there. Because the opening is bigger in the gear. That makes it tough to get this retaining plate on, and we'll get to that in a minute. So to start with, we can go ahead and put the springs in the depressions that do not match up with the opening in the gear. I'll just show you what I mean here. So it's always the one to the left that is the bigger, and these pliers, and again, you want to get about halfway across the spring so that you're reducing the amount of arc in it, and you can drop that in place. I like to use my snap-on soft-faced hammer, and I gotta tell you, I love this thing. This is one of my favorite tools. I've had this thing for years. Soft-faced, dead blow, nice size and everything. When I'm flush with cash, I'm going out and I'm buying the set of 3 soft-faced snap-on hammers. But for now, I own this one. So we tap that into place. We'll take, and I should have mentioned too, I don't know if you guys can see it on any of the cameras here, but the kit, the repair kit, comes with 6 springs, of course, to replace the originals, and 3 bolts to replace the rivets. Let's put another one of these in. So again, to the left of the pair, so we'll drop that one right in there. Got a little tap in there, and the third one. Now, the reason that I'm only putting those 3 in, you're going to see in a second here, it's because if you had those in here, you're really going to struggle to get this gear on, because that spring is going to have a little bit of a curve, the ends are going to be out, and you're going to be wrestling to try and get this over those ends, and it's pretty tough to do it that way. I'm going to try and center that washer, maybe a little drop of assembly lube on each side will help. I'm going to put some lube on the springs, and the reason for that on the ends of the springs is I want these guys to be nice and slippery. When you go to put the retainer plate on, again, we have to remember that this spring, the ends are out a little bit right now. The gear is going to be sitting on there, and it's fine because it's got a bigger opening, but we have to get this retainer plate onto those springs, and I want every advantage to let them slip in there that I can get. I'm going to have to use something like a screwdriver. I've done this, you know, I did a test run on this. I'm going to have to use something to leverage it in there, but we'll get to that. So now we have our gear. Something to remember here is this is going to be turning on here. This is aluminum, this is steel. I don't think aluminum on steel dry is a real good idea. I may be wrong, but I've never had good success with that. So I'm gonna put some of my assembly lube around there and just make sure the whole surface gets covered here. And while I have it on my finger, I'm going to do this surface around here as well. Let's line this up. And we have our spring washer nicely centered there. So we're going to drop this on here, and that's good. It's real nice. And that's really, you know, with that assembly lube, that's moving very nicely. I feel good about that. Just going to look on the back side here, and yes, that spring washer is nicely centered there, so that worked fine. Now we got to get the next 3 springs in. And these are perhaps a little bit more of a challenge. So you can't go as far across the spring, in this case, to hold it. So we're going to have to give it a little bit more of a squeeze and drop it down in there. There we go. And we can do the next one. You have to get a little bit more of that. There we go. That one's in place. And finally, there we go. All right. So all our springs are in. This is nice. We know it's turning nicely, and if we're real careful, we can lift that up. We can check that washer, and if you're not quite happy with it, at this point, you can still move it a little bit. So that's good. Nice. All right, now the big trick, getting this retainer plate on. Better put these 3 little guys in here, because you can't do it after the retaining plate is on. Boy, I would have felt silly if I had done this whole thing and forgotten those. I am going to put a little dab of assembly lube on those just to damp their moving, just so that they don't move around too much. That assembly lube is going to help to kind of keep them in place. So we'll put a little bit of that in there. Now we can get back to our plate. Okay. There. That one might not be too bad. What I'm going to do, and you have to be careful with this, I'm going to get one bolt in and just get a couple threads on it. Then I'm going to move to the next one, and then I'm going to move to the next one. The reason I say you need to be careful is you can get this primary gear cocked on the clutch basket, and that's probably not going to be a good thing. That's part of why I gave it lots of lubrication so it could slide around on there. Not only this way, but I want it to settle in the way it's supposed to be on there. If I lift this and my bush is lined up, I think we can. Oh yeah. So I just need a couple threads on there, and you can see that by doing that, it's got the whole thing cocked over on this side. So I might even take a little bit of that back. And now we got to try and make these springs go in the openings. And just, I'll tell you, I'm going to work at this. I may speed up this part of the video. This is just a time thing, and you just have to work at it. I don't know of an easy or quick way to do this. So let me see what I can do about getting these springs in. Nice, look at that. I think we can get a second bolt in there now. Just wanted to make sure my spacer was still in the right place, and it is. And now we have a second bolt with a couple threads on there. Now we just got to get this last one in. That spring is in place. There we go. We have all three started. It looks to me like we have all of the springs in the retainer properly. And if I look at the gear, it's pretty close. What I'm going to do before I torque this, I'm just going to tighten all three of these down. So everything looks good here now. All my springs are nicely in the retainer. Everything's seated in there. The nuts and the bolt is flush. We're pretty darn close with the nut. Shouldn't have any clearance issues or anything. We've squished a little assembly lube out of the center, so we must have got something right there. Backside, our washer is centered in there. I'm going to grab my torque wrench. I'm going to put some Loctite on these, and then I will I'll wrap this up and give you a summary of what I did and the tools I used, and hopefully if you have to do this, it'll make it easier for you. So let me torque this up. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. I had to change the batteries on my torque wrench. Quick note on torque wrench. Gear wrench, digital electronic torque wrench. Awesome product. Reasonable price, and pretty much the same product that somebody else is selling, but we won't mention any names. Great tool. Just really like working with these torque wrenches. So, little plug for gear wrench there. Now, let's get down to business. We've done everything here. This unit is ready to be finished up. So we're going to take these off one at a time. Oops. And we'll put a drop of red Loctite on there. There we go. 10 foot-pounds. And I couldn't find, obviously, Yamaha's not going to give you a spec for this because I doubt they ever really thought that this would be done. So I couldn't find a torque spec. So I just went to a generic table, one of the fastener supply outfits, picked the size of bolt, and I'm just using a, what would you call it, a nominal torque for that size of bolt. There we go. What we have now is a serviceable unit. I really think that fatigue is the problem with these springs, and that's why you're seeing more and more about this on forums. Can I eliminate these springs? What do I do? How do I get this riveted assembly apart? There's all kinds of stuff out there if you want to do the research. I think it was worth taking it apart. And as I say, now I can, down the road, if I still have this bike or whoever has it, when they take this apart, they've got a unit that they can service, put new springs in. And the springs don't seem to be a problem to get. Oh, that was my torque wrench turning on. All right, let me grab all of the tools I used to get this done, a couple pieces that I need to show you, and I will be right back. Okay, final wrap up on this. Where did we start? We started with a unit that was damaged, had one broken spring, no spring in another location. It had rivets coming through the clutch basket to the backside here. This is one of the old rivets right here, and was unserviceable. There was no way to get at these springs. There was no way to replace them. What I did on these rivets, I drilled it with an 11/32 bit right here. Drilled it to the point where I could get that little ring, you know, where they mushroom the rivet, where I could get that little ring off. Once I broke that loose, I took a 1/4 inch drill bit and drilled further down into the rivet. And I'll just show you that over here. So I drilled further down into the rivet. And the reason for doing that, I wanted to weaken the rivet so it could collapse when I tried to push it out of the clutch basket. Again, you remember that we had those spacers that we put back on the bolts here that were on the rivets. You don't want to drill into those spacers. You don't want to damage that. You don't want to drill into this retaining plate. So you need to be careful to just be drilling the rivet. Once I had that done, I did try and knock it out with a center punch. Didn't seem to be moving. Wasn't feeling really good about that. So I went over to my press, and I used a press, and I'm sure you could probably come up with something at home. It doesn't take much of a press. It didn't take much force at all, really. But what I did was I used a 1/4 inch bolt, put it in the center of the rivet, because I had drilled with a 1/4 inch drill, and then used the press and push this out. By pushing it out, the spacer, the bushing, whatever that is in there, it was fine, undamaged, no problem, so I'm able to reuse that. I'm kind of surprised those don't come with this repair kit, because I can see how they would get damaged fairly easily. The retaining plate, perfect, no damage there, everything was fine. That got it apart. That is how to get one of these apart and put it back together. I'm sure it's going to work real well. I was going to say too, I read that was really a good point as well, is if one of these breaks and that piece comes out of there, you do not want that piece to wind up between the primary gear and the crank gear, because that could be a bad day. And that alone tells me it's really worth checking on these and making sure that they're in good shape. All right, we're going to put more of the engine together. I'm not going to put the whole thing together, but I'm going to put more of it together, and then we're going to put it in the frame. We're going to get a rolling chassis. We're going to see where we're at with this XS650 Cafe Racer project. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful, and if you did and I did a good job, maybe you want to subscribe, maybe hit the like button. Either one I'd appreciate. Okay, thank you very much. See you soon.